Classic muted mic. That's the way we like to start it here. Lower the bar, and then everything's great after this moment. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Arc Studio Presents. I'm Micah Craddy. I'm the head of writing at Arc Studio, and I'm also a screenwriter. Excited to see everyone in the chat saying hello. Let me know where you're watching from and how you're doing today. I'm so glad that you guys are joining us. If you don't know, Arc Studio is a screenwriting app. I assume most of you are Arc Studio users because that's how you found out about this. But if not, you should check it out because it's a great screenwriting app. And we're also having a sale right now, which I'm going to drop the link in the chat right now. It's $40 off for a year of Arc Studio Pro. Yeah, so you should do that. So in a moment, I'm going to bring Peter Ocko on the stage. He is a great writer and veteran showrunner and a friend of mine and my old boss. And so very excited to talk to him, share all his insights. I think you guys are really going to love hearing from him and what he has to say. Just wanted to start off with a few quick announcements. Our next live stream event, so we're going to start doing these more and try to get a variety of people from the industry to come on and share what they have to say with you guys. And in 2 weeks on the 17th, Tiffany Brown, who's the vice president of development at Heartbeat, which is Kevin Hart's production company, is going to be with us. She's awesome. She knows her shit. She's going to have a ton of insights on pitching, the development process, staffing samples, working with producers, all of that. So make sure you join that. And then on January 22nd, we're having a special launch event for a new app that we've been cooking up. It's still a little under wraps, but I'll say if you love screenwriting in Arc Studio, then you are going to love writing everything else in Butterdocs. And if you want to learn more, you can go to butterdocs.com and you should come to our event on the 22nd to really see it and get it kicked off. And then at the end of the month, we're going to do our first Write With Us event where we're going to be on here and we're going to be doing some timed writing sprints together. And it's a great excuse to hang out with some other screenwriters and just get some pages done. Now, without further ado, welcome to the virtual stage. As I said, a fantastic screenwriter, experienced showrunner, a good friend, and my old boss, Peter Ocko. Peter, hello.
Hello, Micah.
You've already showed me up by not being muted when I brought you on to.
I was going to do the old, but too much time passed. The gag was over.
Wow, you did that very well.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm like, did you cut out there for a second? That's a lot. That's a man who's been on a lot of Zoom calls in the past couple of years.
Oh, haven't we all? Yes.
Yeah. Peter, thank you so much for being here. Like I said, Peter has been on a ton of shows, and I was going to read them all out because I thought that would be fun. But then I thought
some time.
An actual more fun bit was to create a ticker banner along the bottom that's just going to scroll your credits. So there we go. It's just going to go on for a while. Peter's most recent show was Moonhaven. I worked with him on Lodge 49. And as you can see, he's been on a bunch of amazing shows. I mean, you see The Leftovers, The Office, Pushing Daisies, 3 Pounds, which he created, Moonhaven, which he created, Boston Legal, Dead Like Me. He keeps going. back all the way to Weird Science, Dinosaurs, and Parker Lewis, Can't Lose. Actually, it keeps going after that. So Peter,
it's a weird zigzag for sure.
I mean, I think that's kind of really interesting these days. Maybe you can talk a little about that. That it used to be a little more. I think we don't need to see the scroll twice.
Yeah.
I could just let it go in the entire times. A lot of love for Pushing Daisies, by the way, in the comments there, which is pretty cool. But it seems like
I can't see the comments, so I'll take your word for it.
All right. I mean, when you started, like you work in both worlds, in comedy and drama, which these days seems kind of common, or at least more common, but I don't think that was always the case, right?
No, I mean, and it's weird for me, I have to tell you, and I feel very lucky to, to be in the situation of looking back over, 35 years of doing this. I started when I was pretty young, and the amount of change that has occurred in this business in general, and I would say it's such an exponential curve. The amount of change that happened in the last 5 years was equal to the 10 years before that, was equal to the 20 years before that. So it's like, I think, that little detail alone, when I started, you were drama or you were comedy. And I remember I spent 10 years in comedy with a writing partner, my best friend, and we're still best friends, but we came out, wrote together as a team, and then realized that we were splitting a paycheck after 10 years that we didn't need to split. So he ended up staying in comedy and I went into drama. But obviously, coming out of comedy, my natural instincts were to, inject comedy into whatever I was working on. And that timed out well because I sort of arrived in drama around 2004. And, at the time it was just kind of beginning that wave of dramas in which characters could be funny. So I feel like and Pushing Daisies is a great example.
Yeah, we have entirely new categories now, like the half-hour dramedy and this whole thing about like these shows that don't really fit into categorizations. They're kind of funny, they're kind of dramatic, but
yeah.
I've always
I would just say like the extended, I used to call it cable, but streaming half hour now, where you sort of have these longer, the kind of a hybrid show after years and years of like, these very rigorous timing deadlines where every script had to be exactly the same length as every other script in that genre. Like, it's really wonderful to be able to kind of jump into a story and say, like, how much time do we need for it? I mean, again, I say all this now, and as everybody knows, like, we're on the verge of another shift, and I couldn't tell you what the next 6 months will bring. Maybe we'll pretend to know later in the conversation, but again, it's having another wild, radical shift, and I feel very privileged and lucky to have been writing during this stretch of time, because things are changing so fast and it's terrifying. And as everyone who's on the outside or on newly on the inside feels, it's a wild ride. But I'd rather be, I think, in this business during that kind of radical change than in the business I started in, which felt so predictable that you'd never get bored of it. But I think what we're in now is far more exciting.
Right. There were like three kinds of shows. You had like a sitcom, you had the police procedural, the legal show, and maybe a couple kind of things that were.
Yeah, I mean, and really, you can mark it by Sopranos arrival. Like, there's sort of pre-Sopranos and post-Sopranos, and everything before that. Not only were the shows kind of predictable and the kind of the way things were sold and all of that, and again, for years that I was in, and like for the first 15 years, that you could set your watch by the season too. You'd be going to work. If you got a job, you'd be working from June, maybe through the new year, and production would start in like July, and this calendar that you could set your
so in the old calendar, the networks would have just picked up their pilots for the next.
Well, the networks would pick up pilots in March or April. You'd be shooting pilots at the top of the year. Right. They'd pick their scripts over Christmas.
Christmas, and then they'd be moving into production. In the new year.
Yeah, you'd go into production. You'd be editing late March. They'd make their decisions, and if your show went, you'd slide right into a writer's room and get maybe 6 to 8 weeks head start before production began. And then again, that's a major change. One that I love more than any other is this idea now that we can do the writing as its own piece without the distraction of production, and then go into production. And it's, I mean, God bless the strike, because it's allowed, I think, a writer to put together a working, wage, being able to live in that system. Because it certainly paid writers better before, when you'd start a show and go through production automatically. Now, of course, writers get hired and sometimes they're gone before production even begins. That's sort of much more common. I certainly feel as a producer, or as, when I have a chance to create a show, it is so wonderful to be able to have your scripts done and then figure out how do you make these, especially on these short orders where you're talking about 6, maybe 8 episodes. You're cross-boarding, which means like you have all these ways to make a more ambitious show with less money, because you have all the scripts ahead of time. And that makes a huge difference these days. So I certainly appreciate that change, I think, more than any other.
It's interesting, though, because there's a double edge to that sword, which is that, so in the old system where writers would be on set way more, and then be going on at the same time. Now, like for me on Lodge 49, so I was, for the audience, I was an assistant on the first season of Lodge 49, and I was a staff writer on the second season. And it was this very weird thing where, as an assistant, I was way more involved in the production and the making of the show than I was as a writer, because I was the script coordinator and writer's assistant. I was communicating with all the departments and working with the scripts. And so I knew way more about how a show runs, but writers get paid way more. So like productions, basically, as studios, want to minimize the amount of weeks that a writer is on a show. And that's what a lot of, one of the issues that the strike was about, was how the rooms kind of keep shrinking and shrinking. But because of that, because of the bifurcation, it gives you more time to yourself. But for the other writers, they don't get the experience, which is sort of hurting us a little bit, in the sense that the next generation of showrunners isn't getting the production experience that you had.
100%. No, what I enjoy about it is purely selfish, because it does. And I think what's great about what happened in the strike, because it was always very hard to justify keeping a writer on when the studio would say to you, but your scripts are finished. Even if you made, as a strong argument, things were going to change on set, you never knew what was coming. It would be great to have help. Certainly in my experience, and I've, worked with AMC since 2015, I guess, they're, God love them, they're very cheap. And, the idea for them of carrying a writer all the way through production there was no way they were going to do that willingly. So, one of the new strike provisions, obviously, is that if you get on staff, you have a chance of being one of the writers chosen to stay through production. And that's, I absolutely learned a ton being on set, or just being, writing a show while it's being made, and understanding that kind of cause and effect between, how much can you pack into an episode and still get it producible. That kind of instinct is, that's half the job of show running, is just having a sense of what can be done for the money you have been given. And, that's definitely something that you pick up when you are exposed to production. I will say, though, that like, as much as you can be exposed to it and sit on set and sort of produce your episode, there's such a big difference between there's like, you can sit on set and produce your episode and really do nothing on some shows, because
there's some great crafty, there's great snacks that you can eat. Like,
there's great snacks. You can gain a tremendous amount of weight in a very short amount of time. But I guess, the thing is, it depends on the show. There's some shows where being in that position on set, you're going to learn a lot because somebody's exposing you to all of that. And then there's other shows where you can go through a couple seasons and really not necessarily pick something up unless you're really proactive. So again, it's, there's no guarantee that this change will lead to more showrunners, but for the people who are interested, it definitely will give them a chance to get closer to the action. And again, like understanding that kind of gut sense of what is producible from the page to your production unit,
I think that's a good transition to kind of the main topic, which is, Showrunner 101. We want to give people a little bit of an insight as to what that means. I mean, I think these days people are way more familiar with the term than they used to be. But what is your definition of a showrunner? What is the scope of that position?
To make it sound as romantic and artful as possible, You know, I would say it's like the conductor in a sense that your job, again, and you don't necessarily have to create a show to be a showrunner, but if you did, you're starting with your script. You're creating something that, again, fits the market, fits what's doable, that it has both like the art that you're in love with, the story, the characters, but it's also producible in a way that you understand, like, I think I know how I would make this given the resources. So you start there, and then, you know, the next thing that comes around obviously is you move into a writer's room, and now you're assembling that, and you're hiring writers. And, you know, again, that can be, there's instances where you have a lot of freedom, and, you know, again, there's other instances where a studio will say, like, well, here's our list of approved people, you know, and you can fight back. And again, like, my ability to showrun has changed from when I started to having done a few shows. Now I'm, again, especially staying with the same network, they trust me more, so I have more freedom to say, like, I don't really love your list, I'm going to hire these people, why don't you take a look at them? But it's all in negotiation. Like, the idea that a showrunner just sort of waltzes in and does what they want. If you're John Wells, for those of you who are old enough or have heard his name, like the old big, you know, 700-pound gorillas, yes. But there's so
Greg
many
Berlanti,
shows.
Shonda Rhimes, these people.
Yeah. Yeah, but I
empire.
mean, then there's the sense of like a despot, right? Like, you get to do your authoritarian, your word is the word. You know, you get to that point. I think, having had successes and kind of put your time in, but a lot of the shows that came out in the last 5 years, like the sort of Netflix explosion, there was a lot of people who were made showrunners who hadn't had a lot of experience on set, whose major qualification was they wrote a great script and had a head on their shoulders, like could convince whoever the studio was that they would be able to do this job. But then they had to learn very quickly by talking to other showrunners and taking, you know, the Writers Guild has all these kind of, you know, classes on how to showrun. But it was less, you know, in those instances, I think a lot of those showrunners were given a lot less latitude. And studios, you know, again, you can be assigned to a studio where the production manager or the producer on set, the line producer, is truly calling the shots and hiring all the key people, and you may be approving it, or, you know, or being able to throw a red flag if you really don't want someone. But a lot of times, if you're new to it, you can kind of get carried along by the river, which is dangerous, because you'll tell yourself, and this was me in my first pilot, like, you'll tell yourself, well, they must know what they're doing, like, I'll just trust them. And then as things start to happen, you realize there's moments when I look back at my first pilot that I was a showrunner on, and I realized there was a couple moments where I should have just walked out of the room and said, like, this is a terrible mistake and I don't want to do it anymore. But of course, I was young, I had an incredible opportunity, and I was like, I'll just make it work. I mean, a perfect example was my first pilot that got turned into a series was at CBS. It was a show, it was a medical drama. And I'd written a script, they bought it, they didn't want to make any changes. It was about a neurosurgeon who has, it was, what?
Stanley Tucci.
Well, this was before Tucci arrived.
Oh, okay.
I had written the script and I'd thought HBO, and my manager, my agent at the time was like, yeah, HBO, but let's just show it to CBS. And I was like, sure. So we showed it to CBS, and they're like, we want to do this. It's, you know, it's different for us, but, you know, we'll make it work. And I was like, okay. And, you know, I guess the moment that I really regret was I had written this to be about the character of the doctor. Now it's CBS, it's 2005, CSI is huge. It doesn't occur to me that kind of show does not fit on CBS, but I'm like, this is the show I want to do. So the B stories in all these episodes revolved around his personal life, and then there was a case, right? And so they were like, okay, we'll try it in the pilot. And it was like, it had a lot of heat because we got Barry Levinson to direct it. And this guy, Dylan McDermott, who was a big star on CBS at the time, was cast as the lead. And we get into it all, and that pilot was terrible. It wasn't terrible, but it did not come out in any way, shape, or form that felt like CBS. And they did not pick it up. And I was like, oh, that's my chance. I blew it. They decided to keep the script, let me rewrite it. And the next pilot season, I rewrote it as more of a hospital show. a little bit less character, but I kept a lot of character work, and we got Stanley Tucci to play the lead, and it got greenlit. And so now we're going to series. I think we had 13 episodes picked up. We start writing them. We get about 5 or 6 episodes written. I think we've shot about 4 of those, and we're about to premiere. I think it was like November 2005. And I get called into a meeting, and I've still worked out these character stories, these careful character stories, episode to episode, because The Sopranos did it. And I was like, let's do it on CBS. And no one had said no. They're like, great, we love it. It's Stanley Tucci. Who cares? We get into the meeting, and they're like, we're going to air these out of order because marketing has decided that episode 3 is really the strongest one. And it was such a ridiculous, bad idea. But I was just told, like, this is the way it is. And looking back, I guess if I could go in a time machine, I would have had a much bigger fit, I suppose. I would have really tried to fight back, but I didn't, and we aired them out of order, and the show was pulled off. I think we were canceled after 3 episodes. And it was, it just felt like so much work, and then it just disappears. And again, this is a wandering anecdote, but I'll tell you, like, those moments when you start out, you haven't developed yet the ability to tell, like, the really big mistakes from the little mistakes. And that develops, I think, at least for me, over time.
I mean, I feel like you lost that battle as soon as you sold it to CBS. I mean, I'm sure you got a good chunk of CBS money, but like once CBS had their hands on it, that show was not meant, not long.
And at the time they were famous for, they aired stuff that Les Moonves loved, and you can look back at what it was. It was all very procedural, very slick. Men were men. Characters were good or bad. It was very, very much a single brand, but they would develop crazy stuff left and right, and it was like Charlie Brown in the football. Like, they just keep saying, don't worry, we're going to find room for this on our network. And you'd get to the finish line and they'd be like, it just doesn't fit. Like,
It always felt like those kind of shows, because at these big, corporations, you have lots of very smart, very passionate, very artistic people who have a limited amount of power. And I feel like they express their power sometimes by developing these projects, these passion projects, because their soul needs it. But there's no way that their boss's boss is ever actually going to put them.
No, and when your boss's boss was Les Moonves, again, this kind of king of CBS for decades.
Yeah. I made him laugh. I made him laugh once. I was a PA on a sitcom that was shooting in Century City, and I was like guarding his parking space, and like I had like the cone, and it was like the Les Moonves because he was coming to the pilot screening, and he like pulled in, and I said something about like his like nice parking job, or like made some sort of comment about his parking, and he chuckled, and like for a moment I'm like, I've made it now. Like my career is gonna sail into the stratosphere. And I'm sure he instantly forgot about me, like even before I left his
I mean, again, not to digress for people who may be bored by anything more than 10 years old, and please forgive me, but I was told he only showed up for the casting of the female lead in my pilot. He didn't show up for any other casting. And before I went into the room, we all go in and we're supposed to look at these 3 sort of finalist actors for this role. And I certainly had my favorite. And they said, great, but Les Moonves is going to turn to you. He's going to say who his favorite is. He's going to turn to you and ask you what you think, and you're going to agree with him. And I was like, and they're like, no buts. That's the way it works. But he's going to make it seem like you have a choice.
Yeah. Probably, yeah. Enough Les Moonves talk.
Sorry.
If you
people are
want to
dropping
learn
off
more about Les Moonves, you can Google him and find out all sorts of really great,
awful things. Yes.
The thing about first time showrunners, that's a good opportunity for a plug. In February, probably we're going to have our mutual friend Andy Ciara on, who was recently a first time showrunner. Andy is the screenwriter of Palm Springs, the movie on Hulu, which is great. Andy also created The Resort, which was on Peacock. So I'm really excited to talk to him about like what that was like to do a show running for the first time.
He will have no Les Moonves stories. His stories will all be within 5 years. So.
Let's get back into show running, because I think it's really interesting, the idea that you get this job by being a writer. and by being a successful writer, but it is in some ways a management job, right? I've heard it described as you're the CEO of like a small corporation. You are dealing with scheduling and budgets and managing people and hiring, and how was that transition for you? Were there skills that you took from being a writer that helped you as a showrunner? It almost seems like completely two different
No,
jobs.
it is. It is a completely different job. It's completely different. And I think for some people, that's really exciting because you kind of have left brain, right brain, and you kind of create a show on one side of your head and then you problem solve on the other. But a lot of it is like a mind for scheduling, like understanding sort of how things will lay out within the time you have. That's a big part of my job. And it starts day one. Even with a writer's room, you hire your staff. And again, I can just speak to that. I read sample scripts. Again, like the stack will come from the studio. I'll get other submissions from agents. Friends will say, you got to read this person. This woman's a great writer. Please take a look at her. It's way too much material in the initial onslaught to like sit down and read through 1,000 scripts. So what I do, and what I think a lot of showrunners will do, is you give a script like 10, 20 pages. And if you're not sort of captivated and surprised in some way, or you see some sort of direct link to the show you're running, you move on. And there's not a lot of sort of like, well, I mean, and I would say if you have a spec that you're using to kind of put yourself out in the world, don't wait till page 20 to like kick into something great. You really do need to kind of use your first 10, 15 pages and put your best foot forward, because again, there's such a volume of people who are competing for these jobs. The process can be arbitrary and maddeningly so. If you've worked really hard on your spec, if I get into a good script, I'll tear through the whole thing and it'll be, it's good for everybody. But you don't really have more than that to capture someone's attention, I'd say, for the most part. So once the staff is assembled, again, the timing, I'll look at the calendar, however many episodes we have, and I know I want to finish the writing before we get to production if I can. So it's kind of a question of like, you take a few weeks to maybe a couple weeks to talk big picture, to kind of talk about the show in the most general terms and not cut off any possibilities that you as the person who wrote the pilot, you might have conceived of the show in a very specific way, but you've just brought in this incredibly talented group of people, and you have to open your mind up and say, like, what do you guys see in the show? And you really do have only maybe a couple weeks to think in that big picture. How are you going to adjust it? What things hadn't you thought of that are now going to play big roles in the season? And then after that, you really do jump into episodes and you're on a clock. And as a showrunner, like your most important job is to get the most out of this team of very creative people, but not lose sight of what needs to be done and when. And it, it doesn't change so much. That part of the job continues right into production, where now, once you're in production, the first thing I do, I had like Moonhaven, we did a season of 6, which sounds so short, I know, but it was, I think we were 80 days shooting the thing in Ireland. And so each episode was cross-boarded. So you have the first 2 and then the second 2 episodes.
What do you mean by cross-boarded? I think people might not be familiar with that term.
So cross-boarding simply means you shoot 2 episodes at once out of order. But what it allows for is within those 2 episodes, if you can share locations between them, share cast, you're able to shoot it in such a way that's really efficient. And I'm happy to speak more if people are confused or want to know more about it. But essentially, it just means that your efficiency goes way up if you can shoot 2 episodes at once. So the same director will shoot a block of 2.
Because normally you'll have a different director for each episode, where the writer, the showrunner, is the one doing the continuity kind of across.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. When you do cross-board in this sense, like I like it because it gives the director more prep time with me and with the cast. You get double the prep time if you're doing 2 episodes. So a director will arrive a little bit earlier. If they're in the middle of the run, they'll have more of a crossover with the director before them. So, she'll be able to really kind of absorb what's going on, the tone of the show. And as a showrunner, that's, again, it's my job to sit with those directors, even if I didn't create the show. So on Lodge, I would sit with each director of the next block, and we'd go through the show scene by scene and talk about, in that case, how it was going to be shot. You know, what the point of each scene is. Sometimes that gets lost. And again, it depends on the show. The shows I tend to do are very tone dependent, and it may not be as obvious, like what the point. It's not procedural in a way that like a simpler crime show would be. So it is really important for a showrunner to sit with directors and say, like, we're getting into the scene. Here's the moment you cannot miss. Because the other thing that a showrunner tends to be responsible for is post. So once all the shooting gets done,
let's jump back in time a little bit. We're kind of running through the whole process.
I don't know. Listen, I'm trying to fit it all in.
Because you know, the audience, you know, people are screenwriters, and I feel like a lot of people probably, you know, their ambition or dream, or maybe some of them already have, is to be in writers' rooms, you know, on a show. So let's go back to those scripts. There's what I think we're called staffing samples, right? That these are the scripts that you are getting. Well, let's talk about that. First off, we have this question here: when submitting, you know, is that the pilot of a show you have, or like? So I think this question is: are those scripts original pilots that each of those writers has written? Are they what's called spec scripts, where they're, you know, existing episodes of existing shows that they've written? What kind of scripts are you reading as samples?
Forgive me, everybody. Let me just go back to the absolute. Your calling card as a writer, as it exists today, in terms of like submitting for a show, let's say a scripted hour or a half hour. If you're submitting for a scripted hour, you, in general, these days would have a sample pilot that you have created from scratch. It's a show that you have thought of the idea, you've created the characters, you've found a template maybe in another show that's similar, that's on television. You've studied that script. You've looked at that structure. You kind of understand how many scenes are going to fit in a 55-page pilot script. And then you've written it and you've shown it to friends and they've given you notes. And then you've maybe, if you know anybody who's actually working in the business, you've shown it to them. And when you think it's ready, and you've gotten more feedback. And so now you've got a sample that what are you
aiming towards there, though, for that script? But I think sometimes a lot of people, when they write that script, they're trying to think of it being made, right? Something that's producible. Is that, or what's the calling card? What should it be? Like, what aspects should be strong in it?
Look, it's a really good question, because it's like standing in Vegas where you can hear the winners from across the room and you feel like everybody is winning. I think nowadays it feels like, you know, if you write your personal script, your voice, your very particular point of view on the world, you've got a pretty good shot of like Netflix making that show. I would say that's a bit apocryphal, that your best bet is to create a pilot that, yes, it would be great if it got shot and it got made. And that is certainly your long-term goal. But if you're just starting out, again, the odds of creating something like that are pretty big. So you also have to think of it as a sample of your ability to solve story problems, to create characters that are interesting, to create moments in a script that are surprising. And that's when someone reads it, the two big check boxes are: one, it looks and feels like an episode of television. And by that, it's really like, and not to sound sort of like, again, I'm going to sound like an old man, but like it has to be formatted correctly. It has to be proofread to death. Like, you don't want dumb mistakes in a script, because generally everything that someone in who's actually working in television reads and works on has been proofread by professional people, like up and down the yin yang. So you're not, you want to make sure, and you just want to make sure that your sample feels at the most basic level like a producible script in terms of how it looks, the number of pages, how, you know, it just has to check that box. The other box it has to check is you have to show off your creativity, if you can put your voice, if you're telling a story that's your own. If, again, for me, I look for moments that surprise, where a character will do something, or where you're able to kind of dramatize a moment with action, that without dialogue, that's kind of, oh, I didn't see that coming, or it has some sort of cinematic poetry to it. Like, you do want to showcase that kind of work within, and again, that's why being able to write a pilot, an original work as your sample, really gives you, there's a lot to choose from there. And at the same time, it can be overwhelming, because it's a blank page. When I started in the business, the sample you would send out is you would take an existing show of television and write your own episode of the existing show, which made it a lot simpler in a way, because what you're trying to do there is copy the voices that exist in that show and put your own story into it and your own, all those choices. But these days, the calling card really is a pilot, and it's an original piece. So, and also, just given that comment, I just want to make sure, like, you want to turn in, if you're turning in a comedy, you want to, I guess, it's probably around 30 pages. If you're turning in a drama, it's around 55, and it has to be complete, beginning, middle, and end, and it has to launch a series. So, but those are the two, most important things in a sample.
I was going to say that, like, even when I was getting started, that was still what you started with, were what we'd call spec scripts in television, which I think are still great practice. One, it's great because write a spec script, I would say, of a show you love, because you inherently know the structure. You know when this character does this, when in the show this kind of moment happens, and you can find scripts online, you can watch a bunch of them, you can sort of figure out their own structure and learn that way. And you can learn how to write in characters' voices, because your goal is to ultimately do that in a sense. If you're trying to get staffed, you're going to be working on someone else's show. So to have practice writing in other voices that aren't your own, is great. But it's also super fun. The first TV script I ever wrote was a spec of The Office, where Michael and Dwight went on a ride along with the police. And Michael left along a video copy of his will at the office in case he died, in the line of duty. And it was real. And it was just like this moment where, because it was before I moved to LA, and I was kind of deciding, like, TV writer, that sounds sort of like joining the circus, which is like, I found out a joke my dad said that my sons run off to join the circus. But I wrote this thing and I was like, oh my goodness, that a couple of these lines actually sound like Michael Scott and Dwight, and like, I'm making these characters I love say what I want them to say. And it was one of the most fun experience I've had, that, like, I can do this. So I think it can be really, really great.
It is, I would say too, it's kind of a lost art. I would say, from a staffing point of view, I've hired some people who have come in with really great pilots, and I was like, God, I loved your spec. But when they got into the room, it was harder for them, for whatever reason, to absorb the voice of the show. Mm-hmm. And it was almost like they were writing a pilot of the show when they wrote an episode. And it was kind of, again, it's sort of not a lost art, but it's two different things. You're showing your creativity and your ability to write a pilot to get the job. But once you're in that room, your job is to really absorb the tone and the way that existing show works, and work within that framework. And I think, these days there's some of the newest writers coming into the room forget that. And they're like, but don't you want my voice? And it's like, yes, but you have to still express your creative voice through what exists in this show. Otherwise, it's not going to make sense. Or at least it's going to be harder for a showrunner like me to be like, yeah, let's try that completely different episode. But, it is two different things.
No, it's interesting, because I remember I used to think the job of a writer on staff was to help write the best version of the show possible. But what that really means is your best version of the show possible. And I think really what the staff writer's job is to help write the best version of the showrunner's show. You need to be rowing in the same direction as them. If you have these brilliant ideas that are going in a completely different way, all you're going to end up doing is pissing the showrunner off.
No, I mean, I worked on a David E. Kelly show once, and he was famous for writing 3 series at once. There was a show called Ally McBeal and Boston Legal, and these shows your parents watched. But he was famous for just being prolific. And all the writers would write drafts, and he'd just throw them out and rewrite them. And if you could write a single scene that made it through, you felt so victorious. And I always felt like if I could save the guy 20 minutes I was ahead of the game for being a staff writer. I mean, and the other part of the job though was he did pay attention to everybody's story ideas. Those he sucked up like a vacuum cleaner. Like he needed people to give him story. But when it came to actually writing the drafts, again, that's a different skill. And sometimes you'll find, especially if you're new and you're like a first-time staff writer or you're just beginning your career, you may not be looked at to write a great episode necessarily as a first draft. You may be in that room to come up with great story ideas and unexpected moments. And that can be a really fun way into everything because it's not all the pressure of the world on your shoulders when you start out. I don't expect staff writers to write great first drafts necessarily. I'm expecting something to come in that's going to be a lot of work to rewrite, but I do expect staff writers to contribute a lot of moments that make it through to final episodes because that's why you're there, you know, especially when you're starting out. If I hire someone at a high level, I will absolutely count on them to write a draft that saves me a lot of time. But, you know, there's all different levels.
I want to dive in more on the rooms. I think that's really important. One last question on staffing. When reading specs to staff up on shows, do you have regular agents you accept scripts from, or do you work with different agents for every show? How does that work? I think that in a broader sense, how do the scripts get to you?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And
because also the flip side of this question is, what if you don't have an agent? You know, what if you don't have reps?
Yeah, no. And what if your agent isn't like CAA and in with the studio? And there's no question that I will get the favored stack of scripts. And that can be like a studio exec whose best buddy is working at CAA. And there's all this kind of politics I'm not even aware of that end up getting me. This is why they love them. Now, I happen to be at a network where, at least for the 2 shows I've done there, I really did trust that the gatekeeping wasn't about politics as much. Like the studio executives I worked with at AMC really did seem to be looking under stones and with less popular agents, for talented people. And that's what you want.
And there's organizations these days now that are providing scripts from underrepresented groups, right? Who are
absolutely. And AMC is really, like, I think proactively, even, before the DEI thing began, they were already sort of saying, like, we need to look everywhere for these scripts. And they were actively asking agents to submit, people who the agents might have second guessed just because they hadn't broken in yet. So there's definitely, I'd say it's better than it used to be, but it's still really problematic. And, I certainly won't not read something from an agent I don't know. If an agent cold calls me and says, I really want you to just take a look, I'll always take a look. So if you have an agent and, they're not the top dog at whatever, some agency, if they're aggressive, sometimes that really does make a difference. And then again, the other way is, somebody who knows somebody. If I get an email from somebody I worked with 3 shows ago and they're like, hey, I got this, would you just take a look at this script? I think you should, it might work for your show. I'll absolutely read that. You know what I mean? So there's other ways to get through the gauntlet. But it is still very much like a gatekeeping gauntlet. It's hard. Just the scale of the number of scripts that are for the number of jobs.
One other question on this: where do you turn your sample palette over to, especially if you don't have an agent or a management team? You're just desperate, hungry grad students. I mean, I think that there is not necessarily a great answer to this, because the real answer is it's incredibly difficult. But I think it's important to say that there are a lot of fellowships and competitions and programs that the different studios and networks put on that are aimed at finding new writers. I was actually looking at a list the other day. The Writers Guild Foundation, if you Google it, has a list of all these programs. I think they're ones that they've kind of vetted and recommend. So I would definitely recommend checking that out. But a lot of the times is, you kind of have to hustle. Like for me, what I did, what is called the assistant route, which is kind of a thing that a lot of people do, where you start as a PA. So like the first thing I ever did on a TV show was restock the fridge. And I learned to do that really good. And the secret to restocking the fridge is when you put the new drinks in, the new drinks go in the back of the fridge and you move the cold drinks up to the front. So the writers always have a cold drink. And if you do that job well enough, I found you start making the writers feel really guilty, because like they know you're a writer And then, they start asking you about your writing. Maybe they'll offer to read something and you can kind of start working your way up. So, I mean, working in the industry is one of the best ways of getting noticed and getting repped. It is
Yeah,
hard.
absolutely. Again, it's like, if I get a recommendation from someone who knows someone who knows someone, that'll mean more to me than getting us, if I get a Facebook message from somebody I don't know, I won't open it because I can't. Like, that's actually exposing the studio to some liability in a weird way, because if you're not represented and you send a script in cold and then it happens to be close to something the studio or the writer's already working on, it can actually cause a lot of like enough legal trouble could potentially happen that, for instance, AMC tells me don't accept cold scripts from people you don't know.
They could accuse you of stealing their ideas, right?
Yeah. I mean, which is silly, but in the 1 in a million chance that there's a giant overlap, and then, how would you feel if like AMC suddenly did a show that was exactly like what you were doing? You'd absolutely believe that it was just taken. So, I mean, it's like, that's for everybody's safety, I suppose. But, there's also in the last few years, not that this is any easier, there's a lot of heat on playwrights. There's a lot of people who have kind of come into television having produced a play or two. So there's, there are other ways. If you're feeling like you just want to be out there writing something that's actually getting produced and you have the ability to do that, that's another, access point. But yeah, to Micah's point, any kind of job within the industry, and there's certainly low-level jobs to be had, from PAs within writer's room to PAs on set, there are opportunities. It's not like those are easy to get, but those do make a difference. You'll bump into somebody, you'll meet somebody who knows somebody. Like that is a route through. And again, as you rise up, like Micah did, if you're a writer's room assistant, if you've made yourself, if you've gotten to that table with the writers, Micah was contributing ideas as a writer's assistant. And that's how we knew, like, okay, you're ready to be a staff writer, because he literally sat at the table and was doing what a staff writer does. Don't tell the guild. But, that's essentially, it was like an audition. So, absolutely.
No, I still remember the day you called me into your office, and I had a good pitch. I just had like one pitch it was like the pitch of the day or something. And that was, you're like, I don't know, you didn't say you promised to staff me next season, but you basically said, like, I'm seeing what you're doing. You're on the right path. And that meant so much to me. Like, yeah, because that's what you're trying to do. You're like, you're dreaming of that conversation. But I think this is a good question right here to transition to talking about the room. Helen, the E on the end makes me not exactly sure how to pronounce it. I feel like, I don't know if it's Helen or Helene probably, right? I don't know. Anyways, Helene Taylor, I'll be in my first room next week. Congratulations. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's great.
What are the top 3 things you appreciate most from your writers?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, I would say this is gonna sound the ability to listen more than you speak when you start. When I started on my very first staff, which was like a show called Parker Lewis Can't Lose, was a sitcom, a single camera sitcom. The first day I got there with my writing partner, the showrunner came to us and said, you guys aren't going to do anything for 2 months. I just want you to sit there and listen. He wasn't telling us not to speak, but he was just basically emphasizing the fact that, like, no one expects you to show up being an expert. And it's really an important skill to be able to listen and kind of pick up on the vibe of the room and pick up on the culture of the room. That's really important. What else is important? I think having a pitch that's thought out, especially when you're starting, it doesn't mean, everything has to be like rehearsed at all. You can have a good idea on the moment and contribute it, and that's great. But if you're going to pitch a story, do yourself the favor of giving yourself a little bit of time to be able to pitch it in a way that has like a beginning, middle, and an end. Even if it's a beat or a scene, give yourself a little bit so that when you're trying to convey it, because part of being in a room is not just having good ideas, it's being able to convey them in a way that people understand why they're good. So give yourself a little time, take a breath, think it through, and then pitch it. I think that's
yeah,
good.
Having a notepad is great for that, because in a room, the ideas are bouncing around so crazy. You're talking about one thing, then suddenly it goes somewhere else. And maybe eventually it's going to come back around to the thing you were talking about. But I would always just keep a notepad where I could write the idea down and, let it breathe for a moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd say even like certainly on the staffs I've had and the staffs I've been on, if you feel like the room is full of boisterous, outgoing people and that's not who you feel like, you can also just kind of get your thoughts together and send an email and just tell the showrunner, look, I had some thoughts today. I couldn't quite get it together. Can I send you an email? And pitch that way. Like I didn't care how I got ideas. It didn't matter to me if someone sold it in the room in some theatrical way. I just needed to like, what's a good story? Like, tell me a good story or tell me a good scene that we could use here. What else? I don't know. I mean, I think
just something that popped into my head, see what your take on this, the idea of identifying the problem at hand. Like, what is the showrunner trying to solve? And putting your mind in that direction instead of just kind of randomly coming up with ideas, but like really being like, what are we trying to figure out right here? What is the problem that the story is bumping up against? And, pitching towards.
Yeah, again, that kind of falls, I think, under listening, right? Which is like you're in the room and you're taking in what's going on. And yeah, you're trying to pay attention to the problem that is, that you're all trying to attack. And I've seen experienced writers just go off topic and get lost, but I think that's absolutely good advice. The other thing I'd say is come every morning with some ideas prepared. I tend to assign homework. You know what I mean? Like I'll say at the end of a day, like, this is what I really want everybody to think of. Can people come up with some pitches on this particular thing? Some rooms will do that, which actually makes your job easier. But I've been in rooms where either I've been showrunning or I've just been a staffer and homework has been assigned. And I see people who've been working in this business for a long time kind of show up and scribble something on a Post-it just as the room begins. And I find that like crazy, because if you've got time to go home, sit in the bath, think about something, come up with one or two clear, good thoughts on, that would help move the room forward. It's great to show up with those in the morning and just have them. You know what I mean? Even if you weren't assigned something specific, kind of do a little off work thinking before you show up. But congratulations. That's fantastic. Good luck.
In talking about the room itself, with the pandemic, the rise of the Zoom room, happened where these rooms weren't, traditionally you'd all sit around a table, and then it, became you'd all sit at your laptop on Zoom. What's it trending towards right now? Are Zoom rooms going to stay around? Is the hybrid room? What does a room even look like these days?
I don't know. I feel we had to do the first season of Moonhaven as a Zoom room because it was dead in the middle of the pandemic. And because it was kind of panic mode and everybody was like, okay, we have to get it done this way, it actually worked really well. The first week of a Zoom room, I don't know what experiences you all had in the pandemic and whether you all had to go through that kind of adjustment as well. And to be in a writer's room for that first week of Zoom for me was awful. It was just awful. It was like the opposite of being able to sit around and kind of play off each other and learning not to interrupt. Learning, again, you sort of had to listen in the way that Zoom forces you to like pay attention when, there's so many distractions. I particularly have it like, it just drives me crazy. I'd say after the pandemic sort of eased, when we got to season 2 of Moonhaven and we were back in the room, I was like, well, let's try a hybrid. And I really regret it because we had like, we'll go in a few days a week and then a few days a week we'll be on Zoom. And that was terrible because we never were able to kind of get a groove going. And also, I think it'll never go backwards. But now, some upper level writers or, someone will say like, can I Zoom in next week because I have to be somewhere else or whatever. And so suddenly you have a room that's gathered and then, someone's on a television screen and it works, but it's not as good. So I don't know. I would say it may, for writers' rooms, it may try and swing back. I don't know that it'll ever fully swing back. I certainly like a Zoom room when I can't be there. So it's not like, I'm religious about it. So I don't know. I think it's going to be hybrid-y for a while.
One thing about that I've noticed from friends, and here's a question from Gustavo here on that. What are the chances of, living overseas working as a showrunner writer? as a showrunner, it's going to be hard, but I've certainly found or heard about more writers. I knew a couple writers in Mexico City who were working in rooms because it was all on Zoom. So I think there certainly is more opportunities because of Zoom for writers, particularly, I would say, if you live in a country that the show you're writing on takes place in, and you can bring that like expertise as a citizen of that country to the show. And the language knowledge and all of them, the cultural knowledge, can be helpful.
Also, like on the last few staffs I've had a few people who live in New York, and they would just Zoom in because they didn't want to have to move to Los Angeles. It was their first job, and I was willing to, to do it. And, that it worked fairly well. The one thing about being overseas is the time difference makes your life absolutely miserable, because we did production overseas, and we'd have creative meetings with LA. So, I'd come back to my apartment at like 10 or 11, and we'd just be hopping on a phone because that's when the executives were sort of ready to meet. And so that, as you get farther away, it does become more of an obstacle. But yeah, I mean, if you're a staff writer and you don't live in Los Angeles and you're not ready to commit to move here, but you have a great sample, there's plenty of showrunners who might say, yeah, we'll take you on and you'll Zoom in.
How do you, this is something I've always found fascinating about showrunners. When you're in the room, like you said, you're switching between the big picture of the full season and the small picture of the individual episodes of the stories you're breaking. How do you do the math in your head to figure out how much time you have, to spend on each aspect, each episode, how much on the big picture, how much of the little? How do you divide up sort of the calendar of what the room's actually going to be doing?
Yeah, I mean, that's where it comes down to. Television is expensive, right? So to make an episode and to hire a writer's room and all that stuff, no one's going to give you, well, again, I have a very particular look. Like, I have a particular viewpoint because I've worked for a network that's not Amazon or Apple or Netflix. And I've certainly heard stories from Apple where it's like, take as much time as you want. We'll hire the writers for as long as you want. I've never been in that situation. My job as a showrunner is always like, you have this much money and this much time, go make a show. And so it's division. You just take the amount of time. You're like, I might get 16 to 20 weeks with a staff of 6 people to write 8 episodes. And so right out of the gate, you're like, okay, I got 2.5 weeks per episode, but I don't want to just jump in on episode 1. Like I said before, you might want to take a couple weeks. And I think it's crucial to think big picture. And then you might also get halfway through a season and realize, like, you got to stop and go big picture again, and just everybody stop. We sort of take stock of where we are and we reorganize where we're headed. And then you get back into the nuts and bolts of breaking the next episode. But it is, it's kind of, you're making those changes on the fly. You're deciding what's the most important thing that day. And again, when I started out, you would also be in production while you're writing. So you'd never see the showrunner. The showrunner would show up at the end of the day and be like, what do you got? And whoever was running the room would say, here's the stories. And they'd be like, well, I like that. I don't like that. And then they'd go back to the stage. And, that's why, again, things have really changed now, because you kind of, in general, you get the showrunner's full attention for the writing, which I think is better,
Awesome. Well, we are running out of time here. Trying to see if there are any last questions I want to ask. Justin's asking about getting scripts to agents. I think maybe we'll have an agent on at some week, so you can ask that to the appropriate question. What is the story? Maybe we'll just end with, how do you actually break a story in the room? What is that process like? How do you come up with the stories with your group of writers?
I mean, sometimes you know that the whole season has to get you from A to B, and you know where you're going to end up. And so, to get there, you have to tell a certain kind of story at that moment in the season. So you might come into the room and say, like, today we're going to try and break a story where this character is going to encounter this problem and they're going to hit a dead end, but it's going to set this other thing in motion, right? So it's really, I mean, there's nothing I'm going to answer in this answer that doesn't sound obvious. Like, I think you really are just trying to solve the problem of, how do you surprise people with the dramatic action of the show, right? And trying to avoid things where you know the audience is going to get ahead of you, or where the audience, you know, where you just know like, the audience is going to see that coming. I mean, the biggest problem and wonderful thing about today's audience is there's so much content, right? And I hate that word. There's so much television out there that everybody's seen everything. You know, people who just lived their lives and watched their shows have already seen way more TV than I ever saw growing up. Like, they're just exposed to stories more. So the job of breaking a story, I think, is harder these days, because you really have to kind of outthink an audience that has seen everything. So, you know, again, the day-to-day, like sitting in a room, you might take, I'd say we'd take a week to 2 weeks to break a single episode. And that might have within it, you know, an A story and then a side story, and you'd kind of interweave those by the end of the second week. But, you know, every day you're just kind of hammering forward and trying to kind of, you know, what's the next problem to solve?
Awesome. There are more questions that we can't get to, but I will say we're going to be doing more of these events with a variety of guests. So we will be bringing more answers to you in the future. Peter, I want to thank you so much for joining us. Wonderful guests, and shared some amazing knowledge. And yeah, thank you so much. I want to thank everyone who came and who commented. Thank you so much for the participation. It was so great to see all the activity in the chat and the comments and the questions, and also people just like talking to each other and the kind of community building there was pretty cool.
Yeah, well, listen, I just wish everyone the best of luck. It really is a wonderful business to be able to sort of mesh business and art, and it's certainly, you know, I just wish you the best of luck.
Awesome. All right, Peter, I'm going to take you off and say goodbye. And I'm just going to end with just a recap on the upcoming events. First off, again, we have that sale going on right now. So if you want to upgrade to Arc Studio Pro, I'm going to just drop that there in the chat. On the 17th, we're having another event from different perspective from a development exec at a production company. So that'll be cool. She'll be bringing, you know, like her insights from her side of the business. So check that out. Again, on January 22nd, we're launching our new app, you know, Butterdocs. Arc Studio is for screenwriting, and Butterdocs is a very similar app, very similar technology, but it's for writing everything else, novels, you know, your blog posts, your business writing, everything. So we're gonna be unveiling that on the 22nd. We'll send you more information about that. Really excited to see you guys, all of that. And at the end of the month, the Write With Us events, where we're gonna be doing live writing sprints. So with that, I will say farewell until next week, and everyone, happy writing.